In 1191, on the burning shores of the Holy Land, a king ordered the execution of nearly 3,000 prisoners. He was not a tyrant in the shadows. He was celebrated across Europe. Songs were written about him. Chroniclers called him fearless. To many, he was the perfect knight. His name was Richard the Lionheart. He spent less than 6 months of his 10-year reign in England. He could barely speak the English language. He raised crushing taxes from his own people to fund distant wars. And yet, centuries later, he is remembered as one of England's greatest kings. How did a ruler who neglected his kingdom become a national hero? Richard's life reads like an epic saga. Rebellious prince, crusader king, master of siege warfare, rival of the legendary Sultan Saladin, a man who fought his own father, defied his brothers, and staked everything on a holy war thousands of miles from home. But behind the armor and legend lies a more complicated truth. This is a story of ambition and faith, of loyalty and betrayal, of battlefield genius and political failure, a story forged in fire from the castles of France to the walls of Jerusalem. And by the end, we must ask a difficult question. Was Richard the Lionheart truly a great king, or simply a great warrior? To understand Richard the Lionheart, we must step into the turbulent world of the late 12th century. Europe was a patchwork of rival kingdoms, bound together by feudal loyalty, yet constantly at war. Kings did not rule neat, unified nations, but sprawling territories stitched together through inheritance, conquest, and marriage. At the same time, the Mediterranean world was divided between Christian and Muslim powers, locked in a struggle that would define Richard's life. Richard was born in 1157 at Beaumont Palace in Oxford, the third legitimate son of King Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine. His father controlled one of the largest realms in Europe, often called the Angevin Empire, which stretched from the Scottish border down through England, across Normandy and Anjou, and deep into Aquitaine in southern France. This vast dominion was not a single nation, but a collection of lands owing allegiance to Henry through a complex web of feudal bonds. It made Henry II one of the most powerful rulers in Europe, but it also made his kingdom fragile and difficult to control. Eleanor of Aquitaine brought enormous wealth and influence into the marriage. Aquitaine was culturally distinct from northern France and England, famous for its troubadours, poetry, and courtly traditions. Richard grew up largely in this southern world, speaking Occitan and French rather than English. From an early age, he was immersed in the ideals of chivalry, warfare, and aristocratic honor that would shake his identity. The political climate of Richard's childhood was tense and often violent. Henry II's authority rested on keeping ambitious nobles and even his own sons in check. Medieval kings secured loyalty through land grants and titles, but these same grants empowered potential rivals. Henry attempted to divide responsibilities among his sons while retaining ultimate control, a strategy that only deepened resentment within the royal family. Richard's older brother, Henry the Young King, was crowned during his father's lifetime, but given little real power. Geoffrey, another brother, held Brittany. Richard himself was made Duke of Aquitaine while still a teenager. These titles gave the princes status, but they remained subordinate to a father determined to dominate every decision. The arrangement bred frustration and ultimately rebellion. In 1173, when Richard was just 16, he joined his brothers in open revolt against Henry II. Encouraged by their mother Eleanor and supported by King Louis VII of France, the princes sought greater autonomy. The rebellion failed, and Henry II emerged victorious, imprisoning Eleanor and forcing his sons to submit. For Richard, the lesson was clear: power in his family would never be handed over peacefully. Meanwhile, events far beyond Europe were reshaping the balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Crusader states, founded after the First Crusade in 1099, had established fragile Christian kingdoms in the Levant. Chief among them was the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a frontier state constantly threatened by surrounding Muslim powers. For decades, uneasy truces and shifting alliances maintained a delicate equilibrium. That balance collapsed with the rise of Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known in the West as Saladin. By the 1180s, Saladin had unified Egypt and much of Syria under his rule, creating a powerful Muslim coalition. In 1187, he delivered a devastating blow to the Crusader states at the Battle of Hattin, where much of the Christian nobility of Jerusalem was captured or killed. Shortly afterwards, Jerusalem itself fell to Saladin, shocking Christian Europe. The loss of Jerusalem sent waves of outrage across the continent. The city held immense spiritual significance as the site of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. Its fall was not merely a military defeat, but a spiritual crisis that called into question the strength and unity of Christendom. In response, Pope Gregory VIII called for a new crusade to reclaim the Holy City, igniting what would become the Third Crusade. At the same time, Henry II's own realm was unraveling. Richard's older brother, Henry the Young King, had died in 1183, and Geoffrey died in 1186, leaving Richard as the primary heir. Tensions between Richard and his father intensified, particularly concerning control of Aquitaine and the question of succession. King Philip II of France, a shrewd and ambitious monarch, exploited these divisions, aligning himself with Richard against Henry II. In 1189, after years of conflict and political maneuvering, Henry II was forced to recognize Richard as his heir. The king died shortly afterwards, reportedly bitter and disillusioned by his son's betrayals. At 31 years old, Richard became King of England, Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, and ruler of vast French territories. Yet almost immediately, his attention turned away from consolidating his rule at home. The call for crusade had already captured his imagination. Richard had taken the cross in 1187, pledging to fight for Jerusalem. His new kingship provided the resources to fulfill that vow, but it came at a cost. Financing a crusade required immense sums of money, and Richard moved quickly to raise funds through taxes, sales of offices, and even the granting of charters to towns in exchange for payment. Chroniclers recorded that he was willing to sell almost anything if it would fund his expedition. England became, in effect, a source of revenue for a distant war. Richard spent only a few months in the kingdom after his coronation before preparing to depart. He entrusted governance to appointed officials, such as his chancellor, William Longchamp, while he assembled a fleet and army for the journey east. For Richard, the struggle for Jerusalem was not secondary to kingship, it was the central mission of his reign. By the summer of 1190, Europe's most powerful monarchs were on the move. Richard of England and Philip II of France set out separately towards the eastern Mediterranean, each determined to reclaim Christian honor and expand their own prestige. The stage was set for one of the most famous campaigns of the Middle Ages, a confrontation not only between Christianity and Islam, but between two extraordinary leaders whose reputations would echo for centuries. As Richard sailed towards Sicily and then the Holy Land, he carried with him the weight of expectation, ambition, and faith. He was already a seasoned warrior, known for his courage and skill in battle. But the crusade would test him in ways no rebellion or regional conflict ever had. The question was no longer whether Richard could fight, but whether he could win back a city that had shaken the confidence of an entire continent.
Richard's journey to the Holy Land did not begin with immediate glory. In 1190, he traveled first to Sicily, where tensions quickly flared. The island was in political turmoil after the death of its king, and Richard intervened forcefully when his sister Joan, widow of the former ruler, was denied her rightful inheritance. He seized the city of Messina after a brief but intense conflict, demonstrating both his military decisiveness and his willingness to assert dominance even over fellow Christians. This early episode revealed a pattern that would follow him throughout the crusade. Richard was brilliant in action, impatient with delay, and unwilling to tolerate perceived slights. His relationship with King Philip II of France was already strained by rivalry and suspicion. Though they were allies in the crusade, they were also political competitors in Europe, and every success or failure would echo back across the Channel. In the spring of 1191, Richard's fleet encountered a violent storm in the eastern Mediterranean. Several ships were wrecked off the coast of Cyprus, then ruled by Isaac Komnenos, a Byzantine rebel who had declared himself independent. When Isaac refused to release survivors and their possessions, Richard responded with swift force. Within weeks, he conquered the entire island, defeating Isaac in battle and taking him prisoner. The conquest of Cyprus was more than a dramatic episode, it was strategically vital. The island became a crucial supply base for crusading forces, ensuring secure lines of communication and resources. It also demonstrated Richard's capacity for rapid, organized warfare. In a campaign lasting little more than a month, he had secured a major Mediterranean stronghold. From Cyprus, Richard sailed to the city of Acre, where the main crusading army had been engaged in a prolonged siege since 1189. The siege had already dragged on for nearly 2 years, with thousands dead from combat and disease. When Richard arrived in June 1191, he found exhausted soldiers and faltering morale. His presence reinvigorated the effort. Despite suffering from illness, likely scurvy were another infection common among crusaders, Richard took an active role in siege operations. He ordered the construction of massive siege engines and coordinated relentless assaults against the city's walls. His engineering and tactical expertise began to turn the tide. By July 1191, Acre surrendered. The fall of Acre was a major victory, but it exposed deep divisions among the Crusaders. Disputes erupted over the kingship of Jerusalem, with rival claimants supported by different factions. Richard backed Guy of Lusignan, while others supported Conrad of Montferrat. Philip II, frustrated by illness and political tensions, chose to return to France soon after the victory, leaving Richard as the dominant Western leader in the crusade. Philip's departure transformed the campaign. Now Richard bore primary responsibility for confronting Saladin. The two leaders had never met face to face, but they quickly became central figures in a contest of strategy and endurance. Saladin commanded a vast, mobile army familiar with the terrain and climate. Richard led a multinational force far from home, dependent on sea supply and vulnerable to attrition. In August 1191, negotiations over the terms of Acre's surrender collapsed. Saladin had agreed to pay a ransom and release Christian prisoners in exchange for Muslim captives. When delays and mistrust mounted, Richard made a controversial decision. On August 20th, he ordered the execution of approximately 2,700 Muslim prisoners outside the city walls. Crusading chroniclers recorded the event with varying degrees of justification and horror. Some portrayed it as a grim necessity in the face of broken promises. Others acknowledged its brutality. Whatever the motive, the massacre hardened attitudes on both sides and underscored the ruthlessness of crusading warfare. Richard then marched south along the Mediterranean coast toward Jaffa, determined to secure key ports before attempting any advance on Jerusalem. Saladin's forces shadowed the army constantly, harassing supply lines and probing for weakness. The heat was oppressive, the terrain unforgiving, and discipline essential. On September 7, 1191, the two armies clashed near Arsuf. Saladin launched repeated cavalry attacks, hoping to provoke the Crusaders into breaking formation. Richard insisted on tight discipline, ordering his troops to hold ranks despite mounting pressure. When the Hospitaller Knights finally charged prematurely, Richard seized the moment, launching a coordinated counterattack. The result was a decisive victory for the Crusaders. Saladin's army was forced to retreat, and Richard's reputation as a battlefield commander soared. His ability to maintain discipline under intense assault and to strike at the critical moment demonstrated genuine tactical skill. Arsuf did not destroy Saladin's power, but it proved that the Crusaders could defeat him in open battle. Yet victory did not bring Jerusalem within easy reach. The inland march posed enormous risks. The crusading army faced dwindling supplies, uncertain weather, and the constant threat of counterattack. Even if Jerusalem were captured, holding it against Saladin's forces would require reinforcements and long-term commitment that Europe might not sustain. Twice, Richard advanced toward Jerusalem, and twice he withdrew. His commanders debated fiercely whether taking the city without secure support would lead to disaster. Richard, for all his courage, showed caution in strategy. He recognized that a symbolic triumph could quickly turn into a catastrophic defeat if his army were trapped inland. Meanwhile, events in Europe cast a long shadow. Philip II was already maneuvering against Richard's territories in France. Richard's younger brother John, left in England, was rumored to be negotiating with Philip. The longer Richard remained abroad, the more vulnerable his lands became. The crusade was no longer only a holy mission, it was a gamble with his entire inheritance. In 1192, Saladin launched a surprise attack on Jaffa, capturing much of the city. Richard responded with extraordinary speed. Sailing from Acre, he led a daring counter-assault, reportedly fighting in the surf as he drove Muslim forces back. His personal bravery was widely celebrated, and Jaffa was retaken. Despite these flashes of heroism, the larger strategic picture remained unresolved. Neither side could deliver a final crushing blow. Saladin could not expel the Crusaders from the coast, and Richard could not secure Jerusalem without risking annihilation. Both leaders faced exhausted armies and mounting political pressures at home. In September 1192, Richard and Saladin agreed to a truce. The Treaty of Jaffa allowed Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem while leaving the city under Muslim control. The Crusaders retained a narrow strip of coastline from Tyre to Jaffa. It was a compromise, not a triumphant liberation that many in Europe had hoped. Richard prepared to return home, his legend already forming. He had won battles, secured territory, and earned respect even from his adversary. Yet he had not reclaimed Jerusalem. The crusade had consumed immense resources and lives, and its ultimate goal remained unfulfilled. As he departed the Holy Land, Richard faced a new danger. The political storm awaiting him in Europe would prove as perilous as any battlefield. The Lionheart had survived Saladin, but he was about to discover that the road home could be even more treacherous than the march to Jerusalem.
Richard's greatest crisis did not unfold beneath the walls of Jerusalem, but in the frozen mountains of Europe. In December 1192, while traveling overland through Central Europe in disguise, he was recognized near Vienna. Leopold V, Duke of Austria, had reason for resentment. During the crusade, Richard had publicly slighted him at Acre, reportedly ordering Leopold's banner torn down from the city walls. Now Leopold seized his chance for revenge. Richard was arrested and handed over to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI. The capture of a reigning king sent shockwaves across Europe. Medieval rulers were often taken in battle, but Richard had been seized while returning from a holy war. His imprisonment transformed him from crusading hero into political hostage. Henry VI demanded an enormous ransom, set at 150,000 marks, a sum roughly equivalent to several years of England's royal revenue. The burden fell squarely on Richard's kingdom. Taxes were raised to unprecedented levels. Church treasures were confiscated. Silver was collected from towns and villages across England and Normandy. Even ordinary people felt the weight of freeing their absent king. While the ransom was gathered, Philip II of France and Richard's brother John saw opportunity. Philip offered the emperor money to keep Richard imprisoned longer. John maneuvered to strengthen his own position in England and reportedly sought support for claims to the throne. The alliances and loyalties that had seemed stable during Richard's departure now appeared fragile. Richard, meanwhile, endured captivity in imperial custody. Though not confined in chains in a dungeon, he was closely guarded and moved between castles. Negotiations dragged on for months. The emperor sought not only money, but political concessions. Richard was required to swear fealty to Henry VI and acknowledge a degree of imperial overlordship, a symbolic humiliation for a king of England. In February 1194, after more than a year in captivity, the ransom was finally paid and Richard was released. He returned to England to a carefully staged welcome. Chroniclers describe crowds celebrating his arrival, reinforcing his image as a wronged hero restored. Yet he stayed only briefly. Within weeks, he was crowned again in a second coronation ceremony, intended to reassert his authority, and then turned his attention back to France. The true turning point of Richard's reign came not in the Holy Land, but in the years that followed. From 1194 until his death, he devoted himself almost entirely to war against Philip II. The conflict centered on control of Normandy and the vast continental territories inherited from his father. Richard proved as relentless in Europe as he had been in the Levant. He reorganized defenses, rebuilt alliances, and launched aggressive campaigns to recover lands lost during his captivity. His military skill remained formidable. In 1198, at the Battle of Gisors, he defeated Philip's forces and reportedly declared that God and his right were on his side. To secure his frontiers, he ordered the construction of Château Gaillard, a massive fortress overlooking the Seine River. It was an architectural statement of power, designed to block French expansion into Normandy. Yet even as Richard fought to preserve his empire, his resources were stretched thin. Continuous warfare required heavy taxation and strict financial administration. England remained primarily a source of revenue rather than a focus of governance. Richard's personal leadership was concentrated on campaigns abroad, reinforcing the image of a warrior king whose throne was wherever his army stood. In March 1199, during a minor campaign in the Limousin region of France, Richard laid siege to the small castle of Châlus-Chabrol. The conflict arose over a reported treasure found by a local lord, which Richard claimed as his feudal right. It was not a grand crusade or a decisive clash with Philip, but a routine assertion of authority. During the siege, Richard rode close to the walls to observe progress. A crossbow bolt struck him in the shoulder or neck, likely fired by a defender named Bertrand de Gourdon. The wound at first seemed manageable, but infection quickly set in. Medieval medicine could do little against sepsis. Over the following days, Richard's condition worsened. He reportedly forgave the crossbowman before his death, though the reliability of that account is debated among historians.
On April 6, 1199, at the age of 41, Richard the Lionheart died from complications of the wound. His death was sudden and in many ways anticlimactic. After years of legendary battles against Saladin and high-stakes conflict with Philip II, he fell during a minor siege over a disputed treasure. Yet the consequences were immense. Richard left no legitimate heirs. The vast Angevin empire he had fought to defend now passed to his brother John. The moment was heavy with inevitability. Richard's life had been defined by war, and war ultimately claimed him. The turning point of his story was not a triumphant conquest or a dramatic liberation of Jerusalem, but the realization that even the most celebrated warrior could not secure lasting stability through force alone. His death set in motion a chain of events that would unravel much of what his family had built.
Richard's body was divided in death, a reflection of the fractured empire he had ruled. His heart was buried at Rouen in Normandy, his entrails at the site of his death in Chaillot, and his body laid to rest beside his father at Fontevraud Abbey. The separation was symbolic as much as practical. Richard had been King of England, but his life and loyalties were deeply rooted in his continental domains. The crown passed to his younger brother, John. Unlike Richard, John lacked both his military reputation and his commanding presence. Almost immediately, he faced challenges to his authority. Philip II of France moved quickly to exploit the transition, renewing pressure on Normandy and other territories. Within 5 years, in 1204, much of the Angevin Empire in France would be lost to the French crown. In this sense, Richard's relentless warfare had only delayed an inevitable shift in power. He had defended his lands with skill, but he left no stable settlement and no direct heir. The empire he inherited from Henry II began to fracture soon after his death. John's failures would ultimately contribute to internal rebellion in England, culminating in the sealing of Magna Carta in 1215, a document that reshaped the relationship between the English monarchy and its barons. Richard's absence from England during most of his reign also had lasting effects. He spent roughly 6 months in the kingdom as king. Administration was largely delegated to capable ministers such as Hubert Walter, who maintained order and fiscal stability. In some respects, this delegation strengthened bureaucratic governance as royal officials learned to operate with limited direct oversight. Yet it also reinforced the perception that England was a financial base for foreign ambitions rather than the center of royal attention. In the broader context of the Crusades, Richard's campaign did not achieve its ultimate objective. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control. However, the coastal territories secured during the Third Crusade prolonged the existence of the remaining Crusader states for nearly another century. The truce with Saladin allowed Christian pilgrims to visit holy sites, preserving a measure of access that had seemed impossible after 1187. Richard's personal reputation endured long after the political realities faded. Medieval chroniclers praised his courage, generosity, and battlefield prowess. Even some Muslim writers acknowledged his skill and determination, though they remained critical of his brutality. Over time, his image was polished into that of the ideal Christian knight, brave and uncompromising. In England, later generations elevated him into legend. Ballads and romances celebrated his exploits, and he became associated with tales of Robin Hood, though these stories were shaped centuries after his death. The contrast between the absent warrior king and the troubled reign of John may have amplified nostalgia for Richard's rule. In memory, he became a symbol of strength during an era of uncertainty. Modern historians take a more measured view.
Richard was undeniably a gifted military commander, capable of inspiring loyalty and executing complex operations. Yet he was also a ruler who prioritized war over governance, who taxed heavily to fund distant campaigns, and whose policies did not secure long-term stability. His greatness largely depends on the criteria applied. As a warrior, he excelled. As a king responsible for enduring political order, his record is more mixed. Still, Richard's life shaped the trajectory of England and France in profound ways. His struggles with Philip II intensified the rivalry between the two kingdoms, a rivalry that would echo into the Hundred Years' War. His captivity demonstrated the vulnerability of even the most powerful monarchs. His death accelerated the collapse of the Angevin Empire and indirectly set the stage for constitutional developments in England. Richard the Lionheart remains one of the most recognizable figures of the Middle Ages, not because he built lasting institutions or transformed domestic law, but because he embodied the martial values of his age with unmatched intensity. His legend grew from real battles, real risks, and real consequences, even if the outcomes were more complicated than the stories suggest.
Richard the Lionheart forces us to confront a timeless question about leadership. Is greatness measured by courage on the battlefield or by stability at home? He inspired armies, defeated formidable enemies, and earned respect even from his rivals. Yet the kingdom he left behind was financially strained, politically fragile, and soon diminished. He was a king who lived like a knight, driven by honor, ambition, and the expectations of his age. In the world of the 12th century, that made him extraordinary. In the long arc of history, it makes him complicated. His story reminds us that glory and responsibility do not always move in the same direction. Perhaps that is why Richard endures in memory. He represents the peak of medieval chivalry, but also its limits. A man who could win battles across continents, yet could not secure lasting peace for his own realm. So what do you think defines a truly great ruler? Is it victory, vision, or the legacy left behind? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into history, consider liking the video and subscribing for more stories that uncover the truth behind the legends.